This is the story of Samson, the strongest man in Israel, chosen before he was born, set apart for a divine purpose, and gifted with power that made nations fear his name. Before he ever lifted a weapon, before he ever stood alone against an army, an angel had declared that his life would be different. He would be consecrated from the womb, marked by a covenant that symbolized his strength and his calling. No razor would touch his head. No compromise would define his devotion. His power would not come from muscle alone, but from obedience. And for a time, nothing could stand against him. He tore a lion apart with his bare hands. He broke ropes as if they were threads. He struck down enemies by the hundreds and walked away untouched. The Spirit of the Lord moved upon him, and Israel saw in him the beginning of deliverance. But strength without restraint is dangerous. Calling without discipline is fragile. And Samson, for all his power, never learned to guard his heart. Her name was Delilah. And at her hands, the strongest man in Israel was betrayed. His secret was uncovered. His hair was cut. His strength left him. His enemies seized him, blinded him, and chained him in humiliation. This is the story of Samson. The promise and the power. This is the story of Samson, the strongest man in Israel, chosen before he was born, set apart for a divine purpose, and gifted with power that made nations fear his name. Before he ever lifted a weapon, before he ever stood alone against an army, an angel had declared that his life would be different. He would be consecrated from the womb, marked by a covenant that symbolized his strength and his calling. No razor would touch his head. No compromise would define his devotion. His power would not come from muscle alone, but from obedience. Israel at that time was not free. The Philistines ruled over them, pressing their dominance through intimidation and control. For 40 years the people lived under oppression, their strength diminished not by lack of numbers but by lack of unity and faithfulness. It was into this atmosphere of subjugation that Samson was born. His mother had been barren, and like many stories before it in Israel's history, barrenness became the stage for divine intervention. An angel of the Lord appeared to her and spoke of a son who would begin to deliver Israel from Philistine rule. The instruction was clear. The child would live as a Nazirite from birth. He was to avoid wine and strong drink. He was to remain ceremonially pure. His hair would never be cut, a visible symbol of his lifelong dedication to God. When Samson was born, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir within him as he grew. His strength was not gradual like that of other men. It came suddenly, decisively, as though heaven itself reinforced his limbs. Yet strength without guidance can become reckless, and even in his youth Samson displayed a pattern that would follow him throughout his life. He was drawn to what stood against him. Instead of separating himself from the Philistines, he gravitated toward them. One day he traveled to Timnah and saw a Philistine woman he desired. He returned home and told his parents plainly that he wanted her as his wife. His parents were troubled. Was there no woman among their own people, no one within the covenant community, that he should seek a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson insisted. His desire overruled their caution. What seemed personal was also providential, for Scripture later reveals that God would use this desire to create an opportunity against Israel's oppressors. Still, the pattern was visible. Samson moved according to impulse. On the journey to meet this woman, a young lion came roaring toward him in the vineyards. The attack was sudden, violent, primal. Yet the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as easily as one might tear a young goat. There was no weapon, no assistance, no hesitation. He said nothing of it to his parents. The strength was extraordinary, but it was also secret. Later, when he returned to marry the woman, he turned aside to look at the carcass of the lion and found bees had made honey inside it. He reached in and scooped the honey out, eating as he walked and giving some to his parents without telling them its source. It was a small act, but symbolic. A Nazirite was meant to avoid contact with dead bodies, yet Samson reached into death casually, taking sweetness from something unclean. Even early in his story, the boundaries of consecration blurred around him. At his wedding feast, Samson proposed a riddle to the Philistine guests, wagering garments if they could solve it within 7 days. The riddle was born from the lion and the honey, from strength and sweetness intertwined. The Philistines could not solve it, so they threatened his bride, demanding she coax the answer from him or face death along with her family. Under pressure, she wept before Samson daily until he revealed the solution. She betrayed him immediately. When the men answered the riddle, Samson knew what had happened. His anger flared, and once again the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. He traveled to Ashkelon, struck down 30 men, and took their garments to settle the wager. What began as a riddle ended in blood. When he returned later for his wife, he discovered she had been given to another man. Rage intensified. Samson captured 300 foxes, tied torches between their tails, and released them into the Philistine fields, burning grain, vineyards, and olive groves. The retaliation was devastating. The Philistines responded by burning his former wife and her father. Violence escalated, spiraling without restraint. Samson struck them down in revenge and retreated to a cave in the rock of Etam. The Philistines marched into Judah demanding his surrender. Fearing further oppression, 3,000 men of Judah went to Samson and bound him with ropes, handing him over to the enemy to prevent collective punishment. As the Philistines shouted in triumph, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him again. The ropes fell from his arms like burned flax, and he seized the jawbone of a donkey lying nearby. With it he struck down 1,000 men. The battlefield fell silent beneath him. He stood alone, victorious yet isolated. Samson judged Israel for 20 years, yet his leadership did not resemble that of other judges. He did not rally armies or unite tribes. His victories were personal, explosive, often reactive. He embodied strength, but not stability. And strength without discipline always faces a reckoning. As Samson's victories accumulated, so did the legend surrounding his name. Among the Philistines he was no longer merely a troublesome enemy, he was a threat that defied explanation. Armies could not contain him. Ambushes could not trap him. Ropes could not restrain him. Even city gates proved powerless against his hands. The more he humiliated them, the more determined they became to understand him. Strength that could not be matched would have to be studied. Power that could not be defeated in battle would have to be dismantled in secret. Meanwhile, Samson continued moving between Israelite territory and Philistine lands with dangerous familiarity. His confidence had grown with every escape, every victory reinforcing the belief that he was untouchable. When he entered Gaza and spent the night there, the Philistine leaders saw opportunity. They surrounded the city gates, intending to kill him at first light, but Samson rose at midnight instead, walked to the gate, tore it from its posts along with its bars, lifted the entire structure onto his shoulders, and carried it uphill. It was not merely an escape, it was a spectacle. The image of their fortified gate resting on a distant hill was a public reminder that their strength was inferior to his. Yet what appeared as dominance from the outside may have been feeding something inwardly more dangerous than pride, it may have been feeding presumption. Soon after this display, Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek. Her name was Delilah. Unlike previous encounters that were fueled by impulse, this connection appeared sustained and personal. He returned to her repeatedly. He lingered. He confided. The Philistine rulers noticed. They understood that affection creates vulnerability where fear cannot. Instead of assembling warriors, they assembled silver. Each lord of the Philistines approached Delilah privately and offered her a substantial sum if she could discover the secret of Samson's strength and deliver him into their hands. The amount promised was enormous, enough to secure comfort and status far beyond what she possessed. They did not demand that she fight him, they asked only that she unravel him. Delilah accepted their proposal, and her strategy was measured rather than forceful. She did not accuse Samson of being an enemy. She did not challenge him openly. She approached him with curiosity softened by affection, asking him gently where his great strength came from and how he might be bound and subdued. The question itself carried danger, yet Samson responded not with caution but with playfulness. He told her that if he were bound with 7 fresh bowstrings that had not yet dried, he would become weak like any other man. The Philistine leaders supplied the materials immediately, and while men lay hidden in the inner room waiting for their signal, Delilah bound him as he slept and cried out that the Philistines were upon him. Samson rose effortlessly and snapped the bowstrings as if they were threads scorched by flame. The scene should have clarified everything for him. Men had been waiting. She had acted in coordination with them. The test was deliberate. Yet instead of leaving, he remained. Instead of distancing himself, he stayed close to the one who had attempted to hand him over. Delilah confronted him, accusing him of mocking her and withholding the truth. Her tone shifted from curiosity to wounded indignation. She framed his deception as betrayal, implying that love demanded vulnerability. Again she pressed him for the secret of his strength, and again he answered falsely, claiming that if he were bound with new ropes that had never been used, he would become weak. Once more she tested him, once more men waited in the shadows, and once more he broke free without effort. The repetition was unmistakable. Each conversation followed the same pattern. She asked. He misled. She tested. Men waited. He escaped. The danger was no longer hidden, it was demonstrated repeatedly. Yet Samson seemed convinced that as long as he did not speak the final truth, he remained in control. His confidence rested not in wisdom but in proximity to the boundary. He played with the edge of betrayal as though it were a game he could manage indefinitely. Delilah's persistence intensified. She shifted her approach from testing strength to challenging his affection. She questioned how he could claim to love her while refusing to share his heart. Her words carried emotional pressure rather than physical threat. Day after day she pressed him with the same question, wearing down his resistance through repetition. What physical force could not achieve, emotional erosion began to accomplish. Samson, who had stood against roaring lions and armed soldiers without hesitation, found himself slowly yielding to relational strain. His strength had always answered external enemies, he had never disciplined himself against internal weakness. Eventually, fatigue overtook discernment. He revealed what had been concealed since birth. He told her that no razor had ever touched his head because he had been a Nazirite to God from his mother's womb, and that if his hair were shaved, his strength would leave him and he would become like any other man. In that confession he surrendered not merely information but identity. His hair symbolized covenant, separation, dedication. It was not magic, it was obedience made visible. By exposing its meaning to someone committed to his downfall, he crossed the final boundary. Delilah recognized the difference immediately. She perceived that he had told her all his heart. She summoned the Philistine rulers once more, and they returned with the promised silver. The room was prepared again, but this time there would be no snapping of ropes, no theatrical escape. Samson rested with his head in her lap, a posture that reflected trust and vulnerability. As he slept, she called for a man to shave the 7 locks of his hair. The razor moved deliberately, removing the outward mark of consecration strand by strand. With each stroke, the visible sign of his vow fell to the floor. When she cried out again that the Philistines were upon him, Samson awoke expecting the familiar surge of strength that had defined his life. He rose to shake himself free as he had before, confident that nothing had truly changed. But this time there was no rush of power. No sudden empowerment. No supernatural reinforcement. The scripture states with sobering simplicity that he did not know the Lord had departed from him. The tragedy lay not only in the loss of strength but in his unawareness of it. The Philistines seized him immediately. There was no resistance. The man who had once broken ropes like threads now felt bronze chains close around his wrists without answer. They gouged out his eyes, plunging him into darkness, and led him to Gaza. The once feared judge of Israel was reduced to grinding grain in prison, forced into repetitive labor like livestock. The conqueror became captive. The strong man became spectacle. For the Philistines, this was more than victory, it was vindication. They had not defeated him through force but through strategy. They had not overpowered his body but dismantled his devotion. The fall of Samson was not sudden in its roots, though it appeared sudden in its outcome. It had been building through every ignored warning, every dismissed boundary, every moment of presumption. His strength had never been autonomous, it had always been connected to covenant. Once the covenant was treated casually, the connection weakened. In the darkness of prison, stripped of sight and dignity, Samson faced silence he had never known. There were no crowds, no enemies charging, no sudden surges of strength. Only grinding labor and memory. Yet even in humiliation, something subtle began again. His hair, once shorn in betrayal, began to grow. In the prison at Gaza, Samson's world narrowed to darkness and repetition. The man who once strode confidently across battlefields now walked in circles behind stone walls, guided not by vision but by memory. The grinding of grain became his daily rhythm, a humiliating task assigned to him deliberately, reducing a once feared judge of Israel to the labor of an animal. The Philistines did not merely want him restrained, they wanted him diminished. They had removed his sight so he could never again look upon the land he was called to defend. They had chained his hands so he could no longer wield them in power. They had placed him in public humiliation so that his defeat would become a spectacle of triumph for their gods. Yet humiliation often creates space for reflection that victory never does. Samson had spent much of his life reacting, striking, escaping, overpowering, moving from conflict to conflict without pausing to examine himself. Now he had nothing but pause. The darkness around him mirrored a darkness he had not acknowledged before. His strength had always arrived suddenly, dramatically, rescuing him from consequence, reinforcing his belief that he would always overcome. But in chains, he could no longer depend on sudden surges of power. He was left instead with memory, with silence, and with the realization that his greatest enemy had not been the Philistines but his own unguarded impulses. Time passed. The Philistines, confident in their dominance, began to celebrate publicly what they believed was the victory of their god Dagon over the God of Israel. They gathered in large numbers at the temple of Dagon, their rulers and nobles filling the structure with voices of triumph. Sacrifices were offered. Psalms were sung. Praise was lifted to a false god credited with delivering Samson into their hands. The celebration grew louder with wine and pride, and eventually someone suggested that Samson be brought out to entertain them, that the man who once terrified them now be displayed as proof of their supremacy. They sent for him. Blind and bound, Samson was led into the temple by a young servant. Thousands were present, men and women crowding the interior and even the rooftop above. The rulers of the Philistines sat in prominent positions, confident that their strongest adversary had been reduced to helplessness. Laughter echoed in the hall as Samson was positioned between the central pillars that supported the structure. The atmosphere was thick with mockery and self-congratulation. What they saw was a defeated man, stripped of power and purpose. What they did not see was the quiet transformation that had begun in darkness. Samson asked the servant guiding him to place his hands against the pillars upon which the house rested so that he might lean against them. The request appeared harmless, even pitiable. A blind prisoner seeking support. The servant complied, positioning him where the weight of the temple rested upon massive stone columns. Samson stood there, feeling the cool surface beneath his palms, sensing the vibrations of celebration around him, hearing the praise offered to a God who had no power over him except what he himself had surrendered. For the first time in the recorded narrative of his life, Samson prayed not out of impulse, not out of anger, not in the heat of battle, but from a place of humility. His prayer was brief yet profound. He addressed the Lord God directly and asked to be remembered. He did not boast. He did not claim righteousness. He asked for strength just once more, that he might avenge the loss of his eyes and strike a final blow against those who oppressed Israel. It was not a perfect prayer, but it was an honest one. It acknowledged dependence. It acknowledged loss. It acknowledged that the strength he once treated casually had never been his own. In that moment, the story shifted from humiliation to redemption. Samson pressed his hands against the pillars and braced himself. He leaned his weight into them, gathering what remained of his physical ability, trusting that the Lord who had empowered him before could empower him again. As he pushed, the foundation began to tremble. The massive columns that supported the temple shifted under the force. The sound of celebration turned to confusion as the structure above them began to crack. Stone strained against stone. Dust fell from the ceiling. Panic spread through the crowd. Then the pillars gave way. The temple collapsed with catastrophic force, crushing the rulers of the Philistines and the thousands gathered within. The roof caved inward. The walls fractured. The structure that had stood as a monument to Dagon became a tomb for those who praised him. In that single act, Samson killed more Philistines in his death than he had in his life. He died beneath the weight of the temple he brought down. His brothers and all his father's household later retrieved his body from the rubble and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the tomb of Manoah his father. The man who had once judged Israel for 20 years was laid to rest not as a king or a general, but as a complicated figure whose life embodied both divine empowerment and human weakness. Samson's legacy is not simple. He was chosen before birth, empowered by the Spirit of the Lord, set apart by covenant. He demonstrated courage in battle and strength beyond natural explanation. Yet he also demonstrated recklessness, impulsiveness, and susceptibility to temptation. His victories were extraordinary, but his discipline was inconsistent. He moved close to danger repeatedly, testing boundaries rather than honoring them, until the very covenant that sustained his strength was treated as negotiable. What makes Samson's story powerful is not merely the spectacle of his feats, but the tension between calling and character. His strength was always meant to serve a purpose greater than personal desire. When aligned with obedience, it brought deliverance. When entangled with compromise, it led to captivity. His blindness in prison symbolized more than physical loss, it represented the spiritual blindness that had developed gradually long before Delilah ever lifted a razor. And yet, even in failure, his story does not end without hope. His final act was not rooted in pride but in prayer. In his lowest moment, stripped of vision and dignity, he turned back to the source of his strength. The God who had departed when the covenant was disregarded responded when humility returned. The final collapse of the temple was not merely vengeance, it was the beginning of deliverance for Israel, a reminder that even broken instruments can be used for divine purpose. Samson's life warns against presumption, against believing that gifts can be separated from devotion, against assuming that repeated rescue guarantees permanent protection. It reminds that strength, whether physical, intellectual, or spiritual, must be guarded with discipline and humility. His story illustrates how gradual compromise can undo what dramatic victories once established, and how the most dangerous battles are often internal rather than external. He remains remembered as the strongest man in Israel, but his true significance lies in the complexity of his journey. He was both judge and captive, warrior and prisoner, empowered and undone. His life began with promise, unfolded with power, descended through compromise, and concluded with sacrificial redemption. This is the story of Samson, the man who lost everything at the hands of betrayal and his own weakness, yet in the end found strength once more when he turned back to the God who had called him from the beginning.